The air carried the smell of smoke and salt from the sea, as the monastery walls echoed with sounds no prayer had ever prepared them to hear. What was happening beyond those stones would later be reduced to silence, softened into euphemisms or erased entirely from official record. Yet for the women inside, this was not an abstract moment in history. It was the end of a world they had trusted with their lives. Christian monasteries, in early medieval Britain and Ireland, were not isolated refuges of weakness. They were powerful institutions, centers of learning, wealth, and influence that shaped politics as much as theology. Within them, women occupied a rare position of authority and autonomy in a society that otherwise defined female existence through men. A woman who entered monastic life stepped outside marriage, inheritance disputes, and domestic subservience. She became legally protected, socially respected, and spiritually elevated. She was considered set apart, claimed by God himself. For many women, monastic life was not an escape from the world, but an alternative to it. Some entered as children placed there by families seeking protection, prestige, or spiritual benefit. Others chose the life deliberately, finding in it education, stability, and a sense of purpose unavailable elsewhere. Inside monastery walls, women learned Latin, copied manuscripts, practiced medicine, governed estates, and exercised authority over both men and women. An abbess could correspond with kings, advise bishops, and control lands that rivaled those of secular lords. Central to this life was the idea of consecration. A nun was believed to be a bride of Christ, her body dedicated permanently to divine service. This status was not merely symbolic. Church law treated any violation of a consecrated woman as sacrilege, an offense not just against a person, but against God. The veil she wore was understood as protection, a visible sign that she stood beyond ordinary violence. That belief shattered when Scandinavian raiders began targeting monasteries along the coasts. When Viking ships appeared offshore, they were not always seeking random destruction. Monasteries were ideal targets. They were wealthy, lightly defended, and filled with objects that held both material and symbolic value. Sacred vessels made of gold and silver could be melted down. Manuscripts could be stripped of jeweled covers, and the people inside were unarmed. What made these raids different was not only the killing or the looting, but the deliberate violation of what Christian society considered untouchable. The women inside monasteries were not collateral damage. They were prizes. The written sources of the period speak cautiously, if at all. Chroniclers mention destruction, slaughter, and the seizure of treasures. When women appear in these accounts, they are often referred to only as suffering greatly or being taken as booty. The language is vague by design. Medieval writers believed that describing certain acts in detail would itself be a form of moral corruption. Silence was a way to preserve sanctity, even if it erased victims. But the silences speak loudly. Letters between church authorities hint at acts too shameful to record openly. Penitential texts wrestle with questions they had never faced before. What happens to a woman who has taken vows of perpetual chastity and survives violation by force? Is she still consecrated? Can she return to religious life? Has her identity been destroyed by something done against her will? The church had no clear answers. For the women captured during these raids, the violence did not end with the fall of monastery walls. They were stripped of the clothing that marked their identity, bound, and marched to waiting ships. The journey itself was a form of trauma. Confined in dark holds, surrounded by strangers speaking unfamiliar languages. Deprived of dignity and certainty, they were transported across seas to lands they had never imagined. In Scandinavian society, slavery was a central institution. A significant portion of the population consisted of people taken during raids, bought, sold, and inherited as property. Female captives were especially valued. They performed domestic labor, agricultural work, textile production, and sexual service. Some were sold quickly. Others were kept for years. Their fate depended entirely on the desires of those who owned them. Christian nuns occupied a particular category within this system. They were educated, often of high birth, and carried a religious identity that made them both valuable and symbolically powerful. Possessing a consecrated woman was more than ownership. It was a demonstration of dominance over an enemy god, a living refutation of Christian claims to divine protection. Saga literature, written centuries later, reflects this mindset with unsettling clarity. Christian holy women appear as trophies, their suffering treated as proof of conquest rather than as tragedy. Their distress was not incidental. It was part of the power dynamic. Some women survived captivity for years. A few were eventually ransomed through complex networks of traders and clergy who negotiated across religious boundaries. When they returned home, they expected relief. Instead, many found themselves rejected by the very institutions that had once promised them protection. Church authorities generally agreed that these women were not guilty of sin. What had been done to them was against their will, and yet they were often barred from returning to monastic life. Their presence, it was argued, would disturb other nuns. It would force the community to confront realities monastic life was meant to exclude. The solution offered was quiet exile, a small allowance, a life lived on the margins. Faith without belonging, survival became its own punishment. Some women bore children during captivity. These children were raised in Norse society, often separated from their mothers, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods. For the women, this meant a permanent rupture. Their bodies became sites of cultural and religious conflict, carrying consequences that extended far beyond their own lives. Archaeology confirms what texts only hint at. Female skeletons from Viking-era settlements show signs of chronic labor, malnutrition, and repeated injury. Burials outside formal cemeteries indicate low status and social exclusion. In some cases, women were killed when their owners died, sacrificed to serve in an afterlife they did not believe in. Yet even amid this brutality, traces of resilience remain. Some women preserved prayers in memory when books were denied. Some passed fragments of language, belief, or identity to their children. A few eventually returned home and lived quietly, sustained by faith even when institutions failed them. The legacy of these women did not disappear. Genetic studies show that large portions of modern Scandinavian populations carry ancestry from the British Isles. Transmitted through enslaved women brought north during the Viking Age, their descendants live on, even if their names do not. What these stories ultimately reveal is not only the cruelty of raiders, but the fragility of systems that claim moral authority. Spiritual status did not protect bodies. Devotion did not prevent violence, and survival did not guarantee compassion. The women taken from monasteries stood at the intersection of faith, power, and gender in a world unprepared to acknowledge their suffering. Their experiences were suppressed not because they were unimportant, but because they were too disruptive to prevailing beliefs. To remember them is not to sensationalize the past, but to confront it honestly. Their lives force us to ask difficult questions about how societies define purity, how institutions respond to victims, and how history chooses what is worth recording. These women were not footnotes to Viking raids. They were central to understanding how violence reshaped medieval Europe, how religious ideals collided with human reality, and how silence became a tool of survival for those who wrote history, but a second wound for those who lived it. Their voices were muted, but they were never absent. They remain, waiting to be acknowledged, not as symbols, but as people whose lives mattered.